Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Welcome everyone to the Matrix Conversations and Transformations, a seminar series from the Department of Critical Theory and Social Justice in Los Angeles. I'm Professor Mary Christianakis, and I'm joined by my co-organizers of the Matrix, Professor Caroline Heldman and Malik Moazzam Dolat. Also joining us is Claire Crawford, who teaches in our ballroom series. Today, we are excited to be joined by Professor Justin De Leon. Before we turn things over to Professor De Leon, a quick introduction to The Matrix and our third season. The Matrix focuses on pressing current events and seeks to connect our community with innovative experts, scholars, artists, and the most effective activists. This third season will be organized around 4 themes. This is the final episode of our indigeneity and settler colonialism series. However, we have 3 other series that we will continue throughout the semester. The first event in our Fighting White Supremacy and Global Ethno-Nationalism series starts in exactly 1 hour with Thalia Lavin's discussion Into the Abyss, Studying the White Nationalist Movement Online. This season, we also have 2 other areas of focus, technologies of surveillance and resistance in the Middle East, North Africa, and among Muslim groups. And our series on ballroom and ballroom culture will resume next Thursday on February 25th at noon with artist and activist Michael Robertson. Please note that we are using the webinar format. That means that you can submit your questions at any time via the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to our esteemed chair, Caroline Heldman.
Hello, and it is my honor to introduce Professor Justin De Leon. He is a visiting professor at the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies at the University of Notre Dame. Professor De Leon's praxis-based research explores indigenous engagements of tradition, culture, and storytelling, and continued navigations of settler orders. He's presently writing a book, Resurgent Visual Sovereignty, under contract with the University of Nebraska Press. The book focuses on indigenous engagements of storytelling expressed through contemporary modes of film and media. He recently edited the forthcoming issue of Borderlands on creative sovereignty with Matthew Wildcat and has published on Lakota cosmology and ontological security, Powwows and warriorhood, indigenous pedagogy, indigenous film processes, and native peacebuilding. As a filmmaker in his own right, his 2018 documentary, More Than a Word, played at over 250 universities in North America, and it was recently screened multiple times at the Smithsonian's National Museum of the American Indian. His upcoming film, in which he is a contributing screenwriter and director of the accompanying Creative Sovereignty Lab for Native Community Apprentices, was recently awarded development funds from the Canadian Indigenous Screen Office and was the winner of the Audience Choice Award at TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival's Big Pitch Screenplay competition. Professor De Leon also hosts a podcast on decolonial and intersectional pedagogies and is involved in multiple Native-based creative collaborations. Welcome, Professor De Leon.
Thank you. So I speak to you today from Ohlone territory. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area, and my work where I teach at the University of Notre Dame is on Pokagon territory. And I speak to most of you who are situated in Chumash and Tongva territory. Many of you have seen and heard land recognitions before, and I want to share with you how I understand them. I understand them as pointing to a relationship of responsibility. And I say this because there's an Indigenous scholar named Hayden King who wrote the land recognition for Ryerson University up in Toronto. And soon after, he actually wrote another piece that said he regrets writing it because he was fearful that it would become just performative. The way I understand a relationship of responsibility is if we were to come to the United States, the second that we pass passport control, we realize that the United States has a set of rules and expectations that if we deviate from, there are repercussions. You could get fines, you can be arrested, you can go to jail. Likewise, when we step onto Occidental's campus, we realize that there are a set of expectations of behavior, of conduct, that if you deviate from, There's penalties to pay. You can get expelled. You could get strange sideways looks from other people saying that person obviously doesn't belong here at Occidental. So that is to say that when we say that we are on Chumash territory, it should tell you that you have a relationship of responsibility of conduct. And if you don't know what that is, then this is a great invitation for you to figure that out, an ongoing invitation. I want to start by putting forward this word, survivance. And I know many of you know what that is, but let me just break it down. It comes from a gentleman named Gerald Visner in 1999, Manifest Manners. And the root word is survive. We know what that is. The ance is a suffix that means the act of. So think of assistance, right? The act of assisting, or to dominate. The act of dominating is the dominance, right? The act of something. So let me give you an example of how this comes to play when it comes to Indigenous studies. We all know of boarding schools, Indian boarding schools. I'm sure some of you have heard of the Carlisle Indian Boarding School. That's in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. These boarding schools took place around late 1800s, 1880s or so, and they were an effort to try to assimilate Native folks into society. It was more humane than killing, which it was, but it still had an assimilative effect. So Carlisle Indian School. So usually they started the Indian schools near reservations, but what would happen was students would just run away. So they said, where can we have this boarding school where they couldn't run away? It was in central Pennsylvania in the center of Amish territory. The first director was a gentleman named Richard Pratt. He's the one who coined that infamous phrase, kill the Indian, save the man. I know you've heard that before as well. So the Indian boarding school, Carlisle boarding school, was roughly, I think it was about 1879 to about 1918, so about 40 years that it was in operation. And it was the model of boarding schools. It was the first American boarding school. There were some obviously in Canada as well. You could imagine, I'm sure some of you have been to the Presidio up here in San Francisco, or even maybe some of the mission schools, right? Where it's kind of like almost kind of a barracks, sort of sparse space. That's what it looks like even today. It was a barracks before, and then it became the boarding school, and now it's the barracks again. To say that the history of Carlisle Indian School was brutal would be a bit of an understatement. I will give you an example. If you go to Carlisle today, there is a cemetery that's on the edge of the campus. And before it was actually near the campus, and then he moved it to another space. And there's a placard there, and if you were to count all the graves, but there's a placard there, and it says that in the 40-year history of Carlisle Indian School, there were 186 deaths or graves that were put into that cemetery. So 186 graves. During the 40-year running of the school, there were 158 students that graduated. 158, 186 grave sites. And those were the ones that were just counted. Those were the ones that were moved and counted. Carlisle had a history of abuse, sexual abuse, physical abuse, killings, murders, medical experimentation. One of the first things that they would do is they would bring Native students onto campus, and I'll show you what campus looked like. You had this administrator building up here, you had a girls' dorm over here and a boys' dorm over here, and you have this big center space. And if you look up Carlisle Indian School, which many of your computers, obviously, I encourage you to do so, you'll see this giant square where you see a picture of all these Native students. That's right here in the middle. So what the priests would do when a student would arrive is they would make them cut their hair, the boys. And long hair is a very sacred thing amongst many Native communities. And they would make them wear Western attire. They would forbid the use of their language. And there's this really powerful story that I share with you. So on this one occasion, this 17-year-old boy came to Farallon. And yes, he was a boy, but at 17, he was really strong. He was the size of a very strong man. And so these two priests gathered him and they took him to the shearing room. They sort of escorted him to the shearing room. When they opened the door, there was a priest standing there or sitting with shears in his hand. And when the young boy saw what was going on, he immediately got really upset, grabbed one priest, threw him to the ground, pushed the other priest aside, and jumped on one with the shears. Struggle ensued. The priests realized that this was not a child and that they could not overpower this young man. So they grabbed his shoulder and said, "It's okay. It's okay. We're not going to cut your hair. Just calm down." Boy left, everything calmed down. Later that evening, the girls were awoken, the boys were awoken, the administrators were awoken. There was a storm rolling in, but in that environment, they heard what sounded like singing and crying. And so the girls peeked their head out the window, the boys peeked their head out the window, and what they saw in the middle of the courtyard, in the middle of the night, was the boy on his hands and knees, crying, singing a prayer. He was cutting his own hair. Survivance is the act of surviving. Okay. Well, welcome everyone. Thanks for having me. My name is Justin DeLeon. I do work at Indiana at the University of Notre Dame. My work really looks around and focuses on settler colonialism, but also the complexities of settler colonialism. And I say that as an embodied sort of endeavor because my family comes from an indigenous region of the Philippines. And we come to the United States, we've been in the United States as racialized bodies. But because I make my home in Ohlone territory, in Pokagon territory, I also produce some of the same colonial violences of displacement, erasure, that my family was subject to. So in one sense, my project is about indigeneity in terms of survivance and visual sovereignty, but it's also a personal story of how I can be both a product of and a producer of colonial violence, right? That is to say that colonialism creates complex puzzles, right? That really evade simple outcomes, evade simple understandings. So that's part of my project. It's to try to step into uncertainty, to try to step into complicity. Okay, so let's turn our attention back to the 17-year-old boy. So as you could imagine, this boy was standing or sitting or kneeling here, and all around him was pain, violence, death, damage. But inside of him, he carried with him dreams, a desire to think about what a life would be for his kids to come, his grandkids, right? So on one side, damage. On the other side, you have desire. This is a framework put forward by Eve Tuck in a 2009 article called Suspending Damage. In that article, what Eve Tuck talks about is if there is a boot on your throat, or maybe we could say more aptly, if there's a knee on your throat, you need to do every single thing you can do to research, to marshal resources, to describe what that oppression is. What is it, right? So what's going on here? But at some point when that research is out there and people can engage it, we have to stop engaging in that research. We have to put a moratorium on what she calls damage-based research. And we have to start thinking about dreams and desires. Because once that boot is lifted, then we can start thinking about what type of world do we want to live in? now that oppression's not here, right? When you think of this, you could almost kind of say, this is what is, and then this is what ought, right? In research parlance, this would be positive, and this would be normative work between is and ought. What is damaged and what ought to be. Now, this framework is actually where my research on Indigenous sovereignty situates itself, right? Indigenous sovereignty as being part of what is, part of that describing the damage, and also being a part of describing what could be, what ought to be, what is the future. So I will turn to 3 examples of how Indigenous sovereignty in my own research engages this framework. And I do this to say that foregrounding indigeneity opens up new spaces of thought and practice. It sounds even silly to say, but people need to be reminded that when we take marginalized perspectives and foreground them, all of a sudden we move into spaces that are completely uncharted, at least in Western scientific understandings. So I would suggest that looking at the space in between of what is and ought helps us to identify fissures and points of fracture in the system, right? Because we're part of this critical theory social justice department, that's what we're looking for. We're looking for paradoxes, we're looking for cracks in the facade, we're looking for these fissures. Indigeneity allows us to start seeing some of those fissures in the system. So I'll turn to 3 pieces of research that I've been working on over the last year. One of them, it's an article that was mentioned in the introduction, coming out in Borderlands called The Space in Between. And that is a sort of a theoretical mapping of Indigenous engagements with sovereignty. So I'll define sovereignty. It's usually used as the supreme and exclusive authority over a defined territory. That's what generally political science, international relations understands as sovereignty. However, when we look at Indigenous engagements and experiences of sovereignty, it eludes that definition. It does not adhere to that space. So let me just say that when you have, in political science, the notion of sovereignty is relatively uncontested. Of course, the enactment of sovereignty is contested. Whose border is that? What land is what? That's contested. But the concept as a whole is relatively uncontested. Now, contrast that to Indigenous engagements with sovereignty, right? Where it's highly contested. And because it's highly contested, there's this proliferation of qualifying sovereignty. So Taiki Alfred in 1999, he wrote this really beautiful piece. Taiki Alfred's this Mohawk thinker. He was at the University of Victoria. And he said, folks, if we're looking at, he doesn't mention Audre Lorde, but my interpretation does. He says, folks, if we're trying to take down the master's house, we can't use the master's tools. That's my interpretation of what he said. But instead he says, look, we can't use state mechanisms to try to disrupt and engage the state because we're just going to find ourselves in the same place as we've always found, under that boot, right? And so what he calls for is he calls for a removal, a turning away from the notion of sovereignty. Native studies people really respect him. However, ironically, instead of taking his call to leave the concept alone, there is this proliferation of engagements with sovereignty. Not because they disrespected him, but because it's what some call a threshold concept. The threshold between, in a sense, you would say between what is and what ought to be, right? A threshold between our dreams and this mired quagmire of settler colonialism. So let me just list some of the engagements of sovereignty from an Indigenous perspective from the last 20 years. Colonial sovereignty, settler sovereignty, nested sovereignty, double bind of sovereignty, temporal sovereignty, third space of sovereignty, intellectual sovereignty, rhetorical sovereignty, network sovereignty, imagined sovereignty, erotics of sovereignty, sovereignty of the soul, and visual sovereignty. And that's just to name a few, right? So this is to say that Indigenous engagements of sovereignty toggle between what is, if we think of settler sovereignty, colonial sovereignty, the double bind of sovereignty. That is to say that even when there are two entities that are trying to be sovereign. If they're in the same space, they're not able to become sovereign at all because they're binding each other, right? So sovereigns cannot reach its full potential because of settler sovereignties, right? The dynamics of it. And then there's also literature around what ought to be the sovereignty of the soul. Intellectual sovereignty is this beautiful concept that should travel in other spaces. Intellectual sovereignty was put forward by a gentleman named Robert Warrior, who said, look, I should be able to theorize as a native man about the entire world and not just native experiences. Why is it that when we theorize about Foucault, no one asks how much Foucault's Frenchness impacts his theorizing of power, but they'll ask that to someone of color. So because of that, we need intellectual sovereignty to be free to move anywhere we want intellectually and not be bound by melatonin or body part. Some of the other theorizing around what could be and what should be, things like sovereignty of the soul, thinking of Sarah Deer's important work on missing and murdered and sexual violence. Visual sovereignty, also imagined sovereignty. So Indigenous experiences resist the dominant definition of sovereignty. When in my research, when we say creative sovereignty, we put forward this three-part understanding of creativity. And I put it forward because it captures how Indigenous people experience the multitude of sovereignty, right? And so creativity. One sense, it could be creative means, literally going out and painting, taking photographs, making films, usually some type of bodily engagement. Second, it means creative thinking out of the box, critical thinking, right? Having a puzzle, solving it, that engages the mind. And the last bit is to create. The act of bringing something into being is a sacred and spiritual practice. Bringing something into being. The fashioner, the creator, right? That's the ultimate adjective for the creator. What is divine is to bring something into being. So when we think of Indigenous engagements of sovereignty, not only being creative in means, film, video, pushing back on representations, creative in thought, in mind, right? Which is intellectual sovereignty and so on and so forth. And also a creative bringing something into new, a sacred practice of experiencing sovereignty and bringing and daring to bring something new into the mix. This loosely overlaps mind, body, and spirit, overlaps with Lakota understandings of braids of hair, 3 braids, mind, body, and spirit, weaving together to create a holistic experience, right? A holistic experience of sovereignty. That's one example. A second example I'll point to, and I won't be long on this. We could actually go into Q&A if you want more detail about it, but it's about powwows, native powwows and sovereignty and survival. Many of you have been to powwows. I describe and I will describe the powwows of the Great Plains are really important. They're really beautiful. So powwows are cultural gatherings where folks come to dance and do ceremony and so on and so forth. They really started around 1945 after World War II, and it took place during a time 1883 to 1979. Native religion was outlawed, completely outlawed, the practice of it, right? And so in this space, when you come to a powwow, you'll notice there's these, it's an arbor, a circular wooden arbor, and there's these flags, American flags that rise from like spires. It's almost very medieval, right? You kind of move into this space and miles away, you see all these American flags flying in the air. They have 21 gun salutes to fallen veterans. Those flags that you see during funerals of someone who served in the military, they fold into a triangle. I never knew what people do with that. But in powwows, they actually ceremoniously unfold them. And those are the ones that are hanging all around, right? Either fallen during war, during battles, or just through natural life. But they ceremoniously put those up. Those what they are. That's what they are. They're veteran flags. So we see a huge amount of valorization of military in powwow. But the question, and here's the puzzle that's very interesting, again, being attentive to fissures and puzzles. So Native Americans have the highest rate of military service by ethnic group in the United States. However, 12% of all medals of honors that have been giving out in the United States have been for the killing of Native people, right? Prior to World War I, the arch enemy of the entire country that we live in was Native people. The Indian Wars drew out all the way into the early 1900s. The people that I work with in the Lakota territory are actual descendants of Wounded Knee, the massacre of Wounded Knee, which killed 200 to 300 men, women, and children by the US 7th Cavalry. Why is there such valorization? Why is there such valorization? Some of the interesting things that I'll just share with you, and then we can go into Q&A, I'll come to this later, is at the beginning of a powwow, there's this song that's sang. It's a flag song. It's the equivalent to a Pledge of Allegiance. And this flag song came about right around the beginning of powwows during a time when it was illegal to pray. And the powwow, the Lakota prayer song can translate to, "We salute the flag of the United States." Pretty simple. Now, when you actually translate it, right, certain things can be translated in Lakota and then also to English in so more of a sort of English way. So the flag is actually translated to a staff, a warrior staff. A warrior staff is a traditional piece of cultural significance for the Lakota. The United States can be translated to grandfather. Grandfather is another word for the creator for Lakota, but it was also a word that the U.S. Cavalry used to tell Lakota folks that the president was their grandfather. So you have this really interesting intermixing. And so what you start seeing is that during a time when it was outlawed to pray, they were actually praying through the flag song, which said, "We honor and pray to the creator and all that the creator stands for." And the colonizer standing on the outside said, "Oh, that's a Pledge of Allegiance. That's great." Interestingly, there was a practice amongst the Lakota back in the day before colonial interactions where when you had a young boy about 11, 12, 13 years old, they would send that young boy off to the far reaches of the reservation so that they can learn with other warriors how to be a man, how to be a warrior. They would go for 4 years or 7 years. Those were sacred numbers, 4 years or 7 years. When they come back, they would be able to start a family. They would be able to serve the people. That was outlawed. It was no longer allowed to be because of the banning of weapons, the banning of all these different practices. Interestingly, and not surprising, but also, interesting, military service for the Lakota, when they enlist as a normal enlisted service person, the years in which it requires of commitment is either 4 or 7 years. Now, it's really 6.5, but before and after, it's about 7. They all said it's 4 and 7 years. That is to say that this notion of transference, that these people were standing here, mired in a sea of what is, and we're trying to figure out, how do we live another day? How do we carry what we have with us to fight another day? This notion of transference to the military service, but really about preserving that autonomy and sovereignty of traditional practices. I can dive into that more if anyone wants to ask questions about that in Q&A. Let me turn to this book that I'm working on around Indigenous resurgence and visual sovereignty. So praxis, we know what praxis is. It's a mix of theory and practice. It's action and critical reflection back and forth. I'm developing a praxis around Indigenous storytelling and filmmaking. Let me just define resurgence really quick. Resurgence is a set of thought that comes from our friends to the north, right above where we all are, up in Victoria, University of Victoria, and also University of British Columbia, essentially saying we can't engage with the state, very similar to what Taiki Alfred said. It is actually what Taiki Alfred said. Let's not engage with the state on its own grounds. Let's not dismantle the master's house using the master's tools. Let's find something different. Let's find something that's in our own cultural strength, our own cultural values, and build from there. So that's resurgence, right? Visual sovereignty, and so let me give you the names with resurgence because you should be aware of them. Leanne Simpson, I know you all know and love Leanne Simpson. She's part of that paradigm. Glenn Coulthard, right? He's part of that paradigm. So you have these big names there. On the other side, visual sovereignty is put forward by a person at UCI named Michelle Rahasia. Visual sovereignty essentially says, look, sovereignty should be a form of flourishing. That's what it's always been about. One of our strengths to flourish as Indigenous peoples has been story. Now, when we look at what's happening today, our stories can reach every part of the globe, not just person to person. And because there's new media, because there's these new technological advances, we as Indigenous peoples need to use it. And we need to resist colonial representations. So some stories about back in the day when they used to shoot Westerns, there's clips of like Lakota actors basically making fun of the people who are making films, the cameraman and the director, and they're supposed to be saying some other thing. They're just making fun of the people behind the camera. So visual sovereignty refers to actual resistance in the creation of representation. But the way I'm using it is the creation of an entire new set of practices that destabilizes the popular production framework and structure of, you would say, like Hollywood or Toronto or whatever you would say, based films, right? And this comes from a practice of mine where I work with Indigenous young people and filmmakers to try to understand what does an Indigenous practice of collaboration look like. And so at UC San Diego, I created this Native Film and Storytelling Institute. We had 25 Native students from around the country in North America, and also folks in San Diego come together and learn about these processes, studying critical and feminist and Indigenous work around representation, but also filmmaking. One of those projects, the script, is the one that won the script award at Toronto International Film Festival. And now we're going into production sometime in the next year, and we're creating a creative sovereignty lab around that, which brings together community members, Native apprentice, and professional production crew to come together to learn about Indigenous worldviews of collaboration. What does it look like to have a methodology of relationality? What does it look like to have a methodology of spirituality? What does it look like to have an ethic of care in every interaction that you have, but yet still be professional and still be productive? That's what we're trying to ask. And maybe I'll stop here and mention some of my methodologies because I think they're really interesting. And we could go back to some of that in Q&A. The first piece I told you about, which is ordering sovereignty within the space in between, is sort of more of a political theory, theoretical engagement. The powwow work and also the resurgent visual sovereignty, I use ethnography. So I'm a critical ethnographer. And I do that as drawing on feminist and Indigenous methodologies. And I'll tell you why I suggest they're feminist and Indigenous. And I'm open to being challenged and open to saying that they're actually not either. But feminist, because I draw from Ann Tickner. She has a 2005 article called "What's Your Research Paradigm?" And in there, she identifies 4 key elements which define my feminist methodology. One of them is that you ask feminist questions, right, about power. The second one is you recognize the emancipatory impact of knowledge. The third one is that you have a practice of reflexivity. You're constantly assessing your own source of power. And the last one is that you create research that's useful to the communities that you live in and serve and learn from. So usefulness. That's why I say it's feminist. Indigenous, because I really draw from the work of Linda Smith, right, who calls us to say, Linda Smith in 1999 and again in 2012 wrote this beautiful book, Decolonizing Methodologies. If you haven't read it, you can order it right now, or at least after the talk, in between the talks, order it. But she calls us to recognize that research, the R word, has been a dirty word for Indigenous peoples, right? Research, in the spirit of research, caused my ancestors and many of your ancestors to have their skulls filled with millet seed to test the volume of a skull to justify the larger cranium size of Europeans. That is the legacy, the pernicious legacy of research that I take part in, that we all take part in. And that's why I really foreground the notion of Indigenous methodologies. So I would say, in terms of actual methods, I mentioned I use an ethnographic sensibility, I do archival work, participant observation. I do ordinary language interviews. I throw out a word and ask how people make sense of it without cueing what type of direction I want them to go in. And then I also use visual methodologies. We can talk about that further if needed. So when we talk about filmmaking practice, and I would also say even when we talk about the powwows, when we talk about filmmaking practice, we're looking at what is. What are some of the spaces that don't work for us, right? I had one native friend who was on a shooting site who said it was a commercial shooting site. He said that his director during a commercial, when things weren't going right, went into a corner, took his clipboard, threw it at the wall, and started cursing for 5 minutes. And then when he turned around to tell everyone what to do, everyone immediately started working in line and they started doing what they needed to do. And he told me that that really challenged and shook his confidence in that person's leadership. But that's the way that films are produced. It's sort of this hierarchical. So films are in this space, but there's something more that it can be. There's something more that filmmaking and storytelling can be that's about telling the story of the nation. It's a recreation of an entire worldview. I look to the construction of a teepee, right? So a teepee, I know many of you know this, the Lakota folks are called the 3-pole people, and they use 12 poles. The first 3 poles, they don't just go up, but they align perfectly with certain constellations. And they represent the sky, they represent the earth, they represent the crater, they represent the grandmother. And then every other pole represents something else. So you have the first 3, then the next 7 are the 7 directions: north, south, east, west, up, down, internal. The last 2 represent the arms of the mother, which keep everyone safe. Everything is so intentional in the creation of this shelter that keeps you warm from the cold. Could you imagine if that type of intentionality was taken up in the creation of a piece that would represent not only you and your people, but all Native and Indigenous peoples, not for just 1-2 years, but for generations to come? What type of level of intentionality would you bring to a creation of representation that has such an impact between what is and what ought? Okay, let me recap and then conclude. So I talked a little bit about relationships of responsibility, survivance, the act of surviving. This notion between what is and what ought, indigeneity occupies both and in between at times. The space in between of sovereignty, this qualified sovereignty, and that's a very interesting subject if anyone wants to talk about it further in Q&A. And we talked about the powwow and the preservation of really important cultural values as a means of navigating uncertainty. And then lastly, this notion of storytelling and thinking about how I can recreate an entire world with intention. In the communities that I work with, there's this term called takini. And in passing, they told me it was about surviving. And I asked further, I said, what does it mean? Because they said it means so much more. And they told me to think of this imagery. They said, think about standing in a field. And when you look to your left, you see your parents and they're dead on the ground. When you look to your right, you see your grandparents on the ground. When you look to your front, you see your aunties and uncles. And over here on this side, you see your siblings. And everyone's dead. And you're standing there looking forward. That is takini. That is takini. And this is the scenario that happened in 1890 at Wounded Knee. We talked about the Wounded Knee Massacre. 200 to 300 men, women, and children were slaughtered by the US 7th Cavalry. There were about half a dozen children that escaped through a little ravine and ran back to now what is called the community of Takini. And so you had this girl, the great grandmother of many of the people that I work with and who live in Takini, who is standing in a field of pain, of violence, of destruction, of damage. But inside of her, she carried with her hopes and dreams of her children and her children's children. That is Takini. If you look up Wounded Knee Massacre, which I encourage you to do so on your computers, you'll see images of frozen bodies being pushed into mass graves. I've seen some of these pictures and images with some of my Lakota friends, and one of the beautiful things they remind me is that every winter is followed by a spring. They remind me that the circle of life is one of when decay, death, damage happens, it's always followed by a springtime of rebirth and renewal and of hope for a new day. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's great. So just so everyone knows, if you want to ask some questions, just click on that Q&A button in the bottom corner. We have about 10 minutes left. Go ahead and put a question in, but I believe Professor Crawford has a question.
Yeah, thank you, Justin or Professor De Leon for that presentation. Can you speak more about the temporality of sovereignty, particularly when you think about the notion of moving from kind of the physical space, that political sense, to even like what is the possession if you think of your own soul, of yourself? Yeah.
Love it. Thank you, Dr. Crawford. So the notion of temporality of sovereignty comes from a gentleman named Mark Rifkin. And what it is, it's very, very interesting that even our constructions of the metaphysics of what our reality is, so like time, space, so on and so forth, is colonial to its core. That is to say that when we understand time in itself, if we take it from a colonial perspective, which is the dominant hegemonic perspective, it also influences our understanding of what progress is. It also influences our understanding of what is contemporary and what is past, what is anachronistic, what does not belong at a certain time, right? And so this notion of progress, I mean, we could think of the 1906 St. Louis World Fair, right? If you haven't heard of that, it's very interesting, where it happened in St. Louis and you had these pens. So St. Louis was really beautiful at the time. They had marble streets and you had these pens. And in one pen, you had Lakota folks. In another pen, you had Igodot Filipino folks. In another pen, you had the Maasai of East Africa, literally locked into pens. In that scenario, who was afforded the ability to have a past and a future, right? The white folks who are walking down the promenade could look literally, say, oh, that was our past, and here is our future, and I can move in between all of them. Black and brown folks in that scenario were fixed. No past, well, really no future, no present, locked in the past. So the notion of temporal sovereignty is the idea that if we understand progress as linear and not cyclical, like those seasons that I alluded to, it forgoes particular beings, spaces to be, right? You lose possession of what you understand is the contents that make up your worldview, right? With Lakota folks, old people and young people are very close to the crater because it's a cycle of life. And so old folks really get along with young folks and young folks get really along, right? Because there's a cycle of life. That is a worldview that allows us to understand that yes, after decay, there's going to be renewal. If we erase that by imposing this linearity, this colonial linearity of so-called progress, right? We're dispossessing people of what they understand as who and why they are. So that's what I'd speak to that. Thank you, Dr. Crawford.
Great. Okay. So let me ask you a quick question on this topic of sovereignty. Can you talk a bit more, just develop a bit more in the time we have, the concept of sovereignty in relationship to gender and sexuality and also age? I know you started to talk about that, but.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really tough one. One of the, not tough to answer necessarily, but a tough concept, tough conversation. One of the most beautiful books is that Sarah Deer's book on the end of rape. And she talks about mobilizing around gender violence. Gender violence and sexuality. Well, let's just talk about gender violence. Gender violence is colonial in its constructs. There's a lot of colonial aspects to gender violence. We could look at the Violence Against Women Act, VAWA, which tried to shore up some judicial holes. So back in the day, Native women could be subject to abuse without finding any way to hold people accountable, especially if they're non-Native, because the jurisdiction of Native tribes was not able to persecute non-Native people. They kept these large gaps, which were taken advantage of by predators. So when we talk about gender-based violence, we talk about sexuality in Native spaces, I think a lot of it has to do with some of the colonial remnants and legacies of constrictive definitions of gender, and then also the violence that has ensued. So one of the things I want to mention when it comes to sovereignty and gender is this notion of two-spirit. And I think many of us are familiar with it. And the notion of two-spirit is similar to what some feminist scholars would talk about queering a concept. And so two-spirit is the idea that most of us are born with one spirit, cisgender male or cisgender female. And some of us, and in this context, the select few, are born with two spirits, right? And so if you approach someone that has one spirit versus two spirits, you recognize that there's a greater power to have two spirits. It's a celebrated space. It's a celebrated being. So interestingly, amongst many of the indigenous communities, Native American communities, two spirits were actually at the center of the community because they held new and unique powers that would double what a normal person would have. Think about that, right? Folks that don't adhere to the gender constructs of today are ostracized, put on the back burner, put behind the bookshelf. Whereas in a community, a Native community, it's the opposite. There's special powers that afford great insight and benefit to the community. So this is me kind of speaking about how we have this sort of like, we have this critique around what is, how gender and sexuality has opened up gaps for exploitation. And then on the other side, we also have conversations about what are the indigenous approaches and understandings of gender that can allow us to think of new configurations, one that are not as constraining. So it's kind of a toggling back and forth, I would say, between colonial resistance and articulation, and then looking backwards to look forwards, I would say, when it comes to sexuality and gender in indigenous studies. Thanks.
Thank you so much for that answer and for both those answers and for your talk. I think we should probably wrap up, unfortunately. But thank you so much. Let me just say, thank you so much for sharing all of that with us and the engaging way in which you presented it. We're going to end this. We have a 12 o'clock matrix with Talia Lavin talking about tracking white supremacy online immediately after this. And next week we pick back up with Professor Crawford's Ballroom series. And if you want to say a quick thing about that, Professor Crawford.
Yeah, so next Thursday, we will have Michael Roberson, who is a consultant to Pose, advocate, part of the ballroom scene himself, and also a theologian. So he's going to take us, compare us to church, thinking about ballroom, church, religion, and how is a space where Black trans women are celebrated.
Fabulous. So thank you again, Professor DeLeon. It was a pleasure. And everyone, we'll make sure that you can find Professor DeLeon if you want to follow up questions. And that's it. So thank you so much for your time, and we'll catch you later.
Great. Thank you all.
Thank you.
That's great. Thank you.